right. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you're listening to us. Thanks for accessing this podcast on your YouTube channel, the U.S. History Underground. And hello to the Underground Army. That's anybody who regularly visits the page, makes use of the resources we post here. Today on the podcast, the Proclamation of 1763. How about some context to start us off? Zags, what do you think the backstory is here? What context should our students be aware of when we talk about the Proclamation of 1763?
Thanks, Mr. O'Hagan, and hello to the U.S. History Army. Well, the Anglo-American colonies have always had this inherent spirit to push west, hence the reason for that French and Indian War. Once the war ended and the Ohio River Valley was in the hands of the British, the colonists felt it was their destiny, or at least their right, to flock and settle into that territory. But, as we know, French allies like the Hurons, Ojibwe, and other American Indian tribes were already in the territory, and skirmishes would soon ensue. Case in point, Pontiac's Rebellion. A broke British treasury could not afford to defend the colonies and felt it would be in their best economic interest to separate the Anglo-Americans and the Native Americans, a decision that would forever have lasting repercussions for the empire.
And that decision ends up being the Proclamation of 1763, this line that's drawn by the British as a way to put a clear boundary between her colonies and colonists and the Native Americans who are living in that Ohio Valley. So I think there's a great opportunity, Zags, to talk about perspective. What do you think your thoughts are about this proclamation line? Well, let's start, if you're a British official, let's start there. What's their perception of this proclamation line?
I think to start it off with the British is they're thinking control. They want to get their house in order. They want to assert more power to the American colonies. Officials in London feared that an increased Anglo-American presence in the Western Territory would encourage Native American violence and incite another expensive war that they really could not afford. We see General Thomas Gage, who commanded all British forces in North America, say, "We shall avoid many future quarrels with the savage by this salutary measure." Clearly stating here that this was a chance for the British to have this separation between the Anglican Americans and the Native Americans as a way to suspend any type of future conflict that may ensue.
And that salutary measure that he was talking about was the line, that it was going to be something
Yeah.
that was beneficial, something that was going to not only help Native Americans, but I think, Gage might be trying to sell it too. Hey, this is good for the colonists. It's going to keep you out of harm's way.
Yeah, they're looking at this as like that parental figure here. They want to assert that control, keep them separated, and move forward with it.
Let me touch on that parental idea, because clearly I think this line is also, from the perspective of a British official, it's a way for the government to stop that westward expansion, which they also had to see as a threat to their own mercantile economic system. Because once these people move west, once they have access to free land and open land, it's going to definitely give colonists a kind of economic independence that the British are not so inclined to want to see them acquire.
Especially because they might have further access to the Mississippi River, which is a conduit to further trade with the Spanish and other countries.
I think also in the back of any British official's mind, they know they've dropped the ball on keeping track of the colonies over the last 150 years, right? We always use the term salutary neglect, but this is really their opportunity in the post-war era to say, nope, things are going to be different, kids. We're going to actually, maintain those responsibilities. We're going to make you toe the line and do the things we said you had to do. And with all the money they just spent on this war, they can't afford to blow their investment. They've got to really be committed after all of the time and treasure and lives they spent fighting this war to now make good on that investment.
I mean, William Pitt said it was the jewel of the empire. They wanted
Right.
to make true on that.
Right, absolutely. I think also if we think about how the colonies themselves were viewed by the British, the British didn't have a very high regard for the people who were living in the colonies. Think of what Lord Halifax said, right? The people of England see America as foreigners. So they didn't feel any responsibility to these colonists per se. And right or wrong, if we look at colonial history, from the British perspective,
They were always the outcasts.
right, the rejects.
Yeah,
I mean, to
they
be
were
kind as we can be, right?
right. I mean, they were the separatists moving away. They were the bottom. They were the landless. Bottom drugs of society, so to speak.
We absolutely celebrate the Pilgrims and the Puritans, but they were troublemakers.
Yes.
They were headaches.
Yep.
So when they came here, all those people you're talking about, the dregs of society, people came as indentured servants,
Yes.
right? Even a place like Maryland, which was settled for Catholics, like from the British perspective, good. Get the Catholics
Get
out.
'em out.
Like we don't need them. They're nothing but troublemakers. So that long-term perception of who these colonists are, it isn't that they're British citizens. They're not equal of the people who live in London and live in the other parts of the empire. These are the outcasts, to use your term.
Yep.
So that's important. Well, let's transition.
Yeah, let's-
We just talked about the British. How do you think the colonists are responding? What's their view? What's their perspective on this line?
I think they're looking at this as being that the British are restrictive and disrespectful to the colonial cause here. For the colonial point of view, they're looking at this as the war's over, so we can go back to what we were doing, but better. Now that the land is in the West, this Ohio River Valley beyond, this should be open to us. This is our territory. We helped fight for this territory. We shed the blood in this territory as well. And now they feel that the British are almost taking the side of the Native American. And to the colonial perspective, the Native Americans' time is up. They're conquered people. Okay, the Hurons, the Ojibways, all these groups, no, this is us. You're out. We're in. It's time for us to have, as you said before, this more economic independence. They want to go back to that salutary neglect. That's what they want to do. They want to go back to those pre-war conditions.
And along those same lines, I mean, we can jump to Washington, right? Because when that proclamation line is passed, Washington and others, in the back of their minds, or maybe in the front of their minds, they're thinking this isn't going to last very long.
Just another British law that we're going to ignore, or just
right. I mean,
go by the wayside.
What does the pattern tell us? The pattern tells us that the British passed these laws and then they don't follow up. Right? Washington even said that this, I say between ourselves, it was only meant as a temporary expedient to quiet the minds of the Indians. So somebody like Washington, who you figure is pretty well tapped into what's going on, he didn't see this as a legit, full-time future policy. That this was kind of a temporary measure, and when the British get tired of enforcing it, they'll walk away from it like they did so many other times.
Absolutely.
All right, we got one last group we shouldn't ignore, certainly with this idea of perspectives. What's the Native American perspective on this, you think, Zags?
I think they're seeing this now as fearful. They're seeing this as fearful due to the fact of now you have a monopolizing European country on the continent, being the British. They cannot play geopolitics, so to speak, pinning one European nation against the other to get themselves, quote, the best deal.
Yeah, losing the French
Yes.
as a buffer, as a counterbalance to the British is huge.
It's huge for them.
The Native. We saw that in the document we did in class with Minivanana, who says, Englishmen, although you have conquered the French, you have not yet conquered us. We are not your slaves. He's trying to draw a line in the sand there, but I think he and other Native American leaders must know, they're in a pretty precarious predicament here, because without that French counterbalance, they know that they can't stand toe to toe with the British, right? I mean, they can't fight them because they're not going to get the supplies they need to do that, which is what they were getting from the French.
Sure.
And think about what from their perspective, can you trust the colonists?
No, you're not going to trust the colonists because they're wanting that land, they're wanting that territory, they want to expand their economic interests in that region, so they're not going to be in alliance with them.
And let's think about what we just said from the colonist perspective. You can't trust the British to enforce the things they say they're going to enforce. So that's the colonial perspective. It's got to be the native perspective.
Absolutely.
Too. They know that the British haven't anyway held up their end of the bargain when it comes to maintaining certain order, when it comes to following through on certain laws that they pass, right? I think the natives have to carry a really serious doubt that peaceful coexistence is possible. Returning to the pre-French and Indian War world, which is what the colonists want, and it seems to me what Native Americans would better suit. They're not going to get it.
No, and I think that takes us to our big takeaway here, is that if the French and Indian War, we could consider this a turning point. This is a turning point and the first steps in the remaking of North America. The British are starting to assert their will through this line is the first step in crafting what the British want as this new normal. Okay, they want to assert power. They want to assert a more centralized control over the colonies, but the colonies are starting to have like almost like this aha moment of what we would consider this own American identity. And the Native Americans want to go, they lost that buffer, like we were just saying. They lost that will to be able to play one side against the other. And now they're starting to have this distrust clearly as a result of the French and Indian War between the colonists and the British.
Native Americans would have been happy to go back to the way things were before the war. Colonists would have been happy to do that, but the British aren't. And when you don't have a third party who is willing to continue with what had been going on, you can't move forward the same old way. And the British, the ones calling the shots, they're not going to allow it. I think that term, the new normal, is what the British are trying to institute, and you're not going to see that. You're not going to see them allow that pre-war society to continue to coexist.
Absolutely.
In terms of the skills, something the College Board will focus on, I think addressing all three of these perspectives is a great way in writing an essay or a short answer question to really think about nuance. When they ask a question that would be something such as, why was the French and Indian War a turning point? If you only talk about it from the colonial perspective, then you're giving a kind of straightforward answer. It's not wrong, but it's very straightforward. What College Board wants to see is a more multifaceted, complex answer. So think about how you could bring in multiple perspectives as a way to address what we'll talk about in the, throughout the year and in the very near future as College Board's reasoning point, its complexity point.
And I would also add to that too, with the new state framework, the term turning point and different analysis of documents that we're going to see on how the French and Indian War could be considered a turning point in the relationship between the colonies and the British. How we could see these different factors, multiple factors that are going to constitute themselves into a virtual move for independence. So all of these factors that we mentioned today is starting to see that transition and movement.
That's a good point. Both the state and College Board are asking for you as the student, us as the ones teaching this class, and we together to think about these topics as being more multidimensional, not just that straightforward answer of, yes, it's the colonists who are most impacted, and forgetting all of these variables that go into making those decisions.
We just want to be more analytical.
Yes.
That's the big picture here. We want to be more analytical.
Nuanced, complexity, multifaceted. That's the real goal when we're talking about developing a strong historical narrative.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to check out all the great videos, content spotlight, and podcasts for the course. Underground Army, you are dismissed.